Northern Wyoming Territory, November 12, 1883. Thomas Hartley, a 34-year-old mason from Lancashire, England, was building what his American neighbors called the ugliest cabin they'd ever seen. While every other homesteader in the valley erected traditional single-wall log structures with stone fireplaces, Hartley was constructing something that looked like a misshapen stone igloo wrapped in rough timber. The thing squatted on his claim like a malformed toad, its walls bulging oddly, its roofline asymmetrical, its entire design an affront to frontier common sense. Samuel Creek, who'd homesteaded Wyoming land for 11 years, stood watching one cold morning and shook his head. "Tom, that thing looks like a drunk man's nightmare," he said, tobacco juice darkening the frost at his feet. "You're wasting good lumber and breaking your back for nothing." Martha Jensen, whose husband had built 3 cabins across Montana and Wyoming, was blunter. "It's hideous, Thomas. Truly hideous. And when winter comes, you'll freeze just as cold as the rest of us, only you'll have wasted twice the timber doing it." Even young Jacob Morrison, barely 22, and new to homesteading himself, couldn't help but comment. "Mr. Hartley, sir, I don't mean disrespect, but my pa always said build simple, build solid, and don't get fancy. That cabin of yours, it ain't simple, and I can't figure if it's solid or just plain confused." What did Thomas Hartley understand about surviving a Wyoming winter that these experienced American homesteaders had completely missed? Before we reveal the ingenious thermal principle that would save his family's lives, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Let's see how many states and countries we can reach. Thomas Hartley's cabin violated every rule of frontier construction his neighbors understood. Traditional Wyoming cabins consisted of a single wall of 8-inch logs, chinked with mud and moss, topped with a simple gabled roof. You built a stone fireplace at one end, cut a door and maybe 2 windows, and called it done. Simple, efficient, proven. Hartley's monstrosity featured walls that bulged outward nearly 3 feet at the base, tapering inward as they rose. He'd excavated a foundation trench 18 inches deep and filled it with creek stones set in clay mortar. Then he'd built an inner wall of split logs, vertical, packed tight. But instead of stopping there, he constructed an outer shell of stacked fieldstone, leaving a bizarre gap between the 2 walls that varied from 14 inches at the base to 8 inches at the roofline. The whole structure measured only 14 feet by 16 feet on the inside, but the walls consumed so much material that the exterior footprint sprawled to nearly 20 feet by 22 feet. The roof wasn't a clean gable, but a strange low dome, heavily sodded, that made the whole thing look like it was melting into the earth. "He's building 2 cabins, one inside the other, and neither one right," Samuel Creek told the men gathered at the settlement's trading post in late November. "I've built in Michigan, Nebraska, and here in Wyoming. Never seen such a waste of effort. Man's got pioneer fever, thinking he's smarter than everyone who came before." Creek had credibility. He'd survived the winter of 1880 when temperatures hit 48 below zero for 6 consecutive days. His cabin had held, his family had lived, and his methods were proven. Martha Jensen agreed completely. "My Henrik knows construction," she said, kneading bread dough at her table while 3 neighbors listened. "He says those double walls won't hold heat any better than single walls, and all that stone just makes the place cold. Stone don't hold warmth worth a damn. That's why we all use wood." Henrik Jensen was a Norwegian carpenter who'd apprenticed in Trondheim before immigrating in 1871. He understood wood, joinery, and practical shelter. When he spoke about construction, people listened. Young Jacob Morrison had watched Hartley work for weeks, genuinely puzzled. "Mr. Creek, sir, why's he filling that gap between the walls with just loose straw and dirt? Seems like he's making a mess on purpose. My pa always said pack your chinking tight so wind can't get through. But Hartley's leaving gaps you could stick your whole arm into." What Thomas understood, and what his critics had never considered, was the principle of thermal mass combined with dead air insulation. a technique that traced its ancestry back to medieval English stone cottages and even earlier to Roman hypocaust systems. The science behind Hartley's ugly cabin was precise and quantifiable, though none of his neighbours understood it. Traditional single-wall log construction relied on the wood's natural insulation properties, which were decent but limited. An 8-inch pine log has an R value of approximately 8, meaning it resists heat transfer moderately well. But wood has low thermal mass. It heats quickly when you stoke the fire and cools quickly when the fire dies. A standard Wyoming cabin with a roaring fire might reach 70 degrees inside, while it's 20 below outside. But 6 hours after the fire dies to coals, the interior temperature drops to 45 or even 40 degrees. That's the math of low thermal mass and single-wall construction. Creek's cabin demonstrated this perfectly. On a typical January morning, he'd wake to an interior temperature of 38 degrees after the overnight fire had burned down. He'd stoke it aggressively, adding 3 split logs, and within 40 minutes the cabin would reach 62 degrees. Comfortable enough to work. But the moment he let the fire drop to maintain those coals for cooking, the temperature would fall 5 degrees in 30 minutes. The cabin had no thermal inertia, no buffer against temperature swings. Every degree of warmth had to be continuously generated because nothing in the structure could store and slowly release heat. Thomas Hartley's design operated on different physics entirely. His inner wall of vertical split logs provided the initial insulation barrier with an R value around 7. But the 14-inch gap between inner and outer walls, filled loosely with straw and dry prairie soil, created a dead air space. Still air is one of nature's finest insulators, with an R value of roughly 3.5 per inch of space when properly contained. His 14-inch gap delivered an additional R value of approximately 40 to 45, depending on how well the fill materials prevented convection currents. The outer stone wall added minimal R value, maybe 2 or 3, but that wasn't its primary function. Stone's value lies in thermal mass. Granite and sandstone, the materials Hartley hauled from the creek bed, hold approximately 0.19 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. His outer stone wall weighed roughly 11,000 pounds. Once heated by the weak winter sun during the day or by radiant heat slowly escaping from inside, that stone mass would release stored heat for hours after the sunset or the interior fire diminished. The math was dramatic. Creek's traditional cabin required a cord of firewood every 8 to 10 days to maintain livable temperatures through a Wyoming winter. Hartley estimated his design would cut that to a cord every 18 to 22 days, a fuel savings of 50 to 60%. The numbers seemed impossible to his neighbors because they'd never seen such a design in frontier America. But variations existed in England, where thick-walled stone cottages with thatched roofs had kept families warm for centuries. The Korean Ondol system used similar thermal mass principles, heating floors with stone masses that retained warmth through bitter nights. Plains Indian earth lodges incorporated packed earth walls that provided both mass and insulation. Even some French-Canadian homesteads used double-wall construction, though typically with both walls of wood. Hartley's genius was combining stone mass, dead air insulation, and timber structure in proportions calculated for Wyoming's specific climate. Creek and the others weren't completely wrong in their skepticism. Building this way required 3 times the labor, twice the materials, and considerable skill in stonework that most frontier carpenters didn't possess. For a simple summer shelter or a temporary claim cabin, Hartley's method was absolute overkill. A man could build a traditional cabin in 2 weeks with help from 3 neighbors. Hartley had spent 7 weeks on his structure, working dawn to dusk, and had recruited paid help for the heavy stone hauling. The material cost told the story clearly. Creek's cabin had required 42 logs, each averaging 14 feet in length. Total wood volume was roughly 2,000 board feet. Hartley's cabin used 68 logs for the inner wall alone, plus another 33 logs for the roof structure and door frames. His lumber total reached 4,100 board feet. The stone represented 3 weeks of back-breaking labor, hauling creek rocks in a borrowed wagon, selecting pieces for size and shape, fitting them together with minimal mortar gaps. He'd moved approximately 11,000 pounds of stone, piece by piece, over a distance averaging a quarter-mile from creek to building site. For a simple survival shelter, this was madness. But for a permanent homestead, expected to house a family through decades of Wyoming winters with minimal fuel expenditure, the investment made cold, hard, mathematical sense. Hartley had built the inner wall first, vertical logs 8 inches in diameter, stripped of bark, fitted so tightly that chinking was minimal. He'd notched them into a timber sill beam set on his stone foundation and secured the tops to a substantial timber ring beam. This inner ring beam measured 12 inches square, hewn from a single cottonwood trunk, and it bore all the roof weight independently of the outer stone wall. This was critical engineering. If the roof load had transferred to the stone wall, the entire structure would have needed buttressing or would have risked collapse. By making the inner timber structure load-bearing and the outer stone wall merely protective, Hartley created a design that was both stable and effective. The gap between inner wood and outer stone he'd filled in layers, and this process revealed his understanding of moisture dynamics. He didn't just dump straw and soil into the cavity. First, he laid 6 inches of clean, dry straw along the bottom, loose enough to trap air but dense enough to prevent slumping. Then he added 6 inches of sandy soil from a high bank, soil that wouldn't absorb moisture or compact into a solid mass that would conduct heat. He tested this soil by saturating a sample with water and letting it dry. It crumbled back to individual grains, perfect for maintaining air pockets. On top of the soil layer, he added 2 more inches of straw, creating a sandwich that resisted both heat transfer and moisture migration. He filled the cavity in 3-foot vertical sections as he built the outer stone wall upward, ensuring the fill material stayed properly distributed and didn't settle unevenly. This layering prevented the fill from settling too much and maintained those precious air pockets that gave the wall its insulating power. The outer stone wall itself demonstrated sophisticated understanding of masonry. Hartley started with the largest, flattest stones at the base, creating a stable foundation course. As he built upward, he gradually transitioned to smaller stones, and he angled the wall inward at approximately 4 degrees from vertical. This inward lean meant the wall grew more stable as it rose, with each course locked in place by gravity and the weight above it. He used clay mortar between stones, but sparingly, mainly to prevent air infiltration rather than for structural bonding. The wall's real strength came from careful stone selection and precise fitting, old-world masonry techniques that English stoneworkers had perfected over centuries. The roof structure was the trickiest part. He'd built a low dome using curved timbers, calculated so the center peaked only 9 feet above the interior floor. This dome rested on the inner timber ring beam, independent of the outer stone wall. He'd covered the dome with split shakes, then a layer of birch bark for waterproofing, then 2 feet of compacted sod. The result was a roof with enormous thermal mass that prevented heat from escaping upward, the direction where heat loss is typically most severe. December 23rd, 1883. The temperature at dawn measured 12 below zero, cold but manageable for Wyoming in late December. Samuel Creek stood in his doorway drinking coffee, watching his breath form ice crystals in the still air. The sky was clear, stars still visible in the west, and he figured it for a decent day to split more firewood. By 8 in the morning, wisps of high cirrus clouds appeared from the northwest, the kind of clouds that signal a major change coming. Old-timers called them mare's tails, and they meant bad weather. By noon, the sky had turned the color of old iron. low clouds moving in fast, and the wind shifted to come straight from the northwest with a bone-penetrating persistence. Creek had lived through enough Wyoming winters to recognize what was building. He split wood for 2 straight hours, his breath coming in harsh gasps, racing to get enough fuel inside before the storm hit. By 4 in the afternoon, it was 26 below. The wind had picked up to 20 miles per hour, and snow wasn't falling so much as flying horizontally across the landscape in stinging sheets. By midnight, -38. By dawn on Christmas Eve, -44 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind gusts to 30 miles per hour creating a wind chill that could freeze exposed flesh in under 3 minutes. This wasn't just cold. This was killing weather, the kind of cold that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground and made the snow squeak like styrofoam underfoot. The kind of cold where metal tools left outside became so brittle they'd shatter if struck. The kind of cold where your eyelashes froze together if you blinked outside. Samuel Creek's family huddled in their cabin, burning wood at a ferocious rate. Creek fed the fireplace every 40 minutes, round the clock, splitting frozen logs outside in the murderous cold, hauling them inside, stoking the flames. Each trip outside was an ordeal. He'd wrap himself in 3 layers, pull a wool scarf over his face, and still the cold found ways through. His fingers went numb in the 30 seconds it took to grab 3 split logs from the pile. His face burned with ice pain despite the scarf. And each time he opened the door, he let precious warmth escape, warmth that took 10 minutes and 3 more logs to restore. His wife, Margaret, and their 2 children, ages 9 and 6, slept fully dressed under every blanket they owned, positioned as close to the fireplace as safety allowed. Margaret had created a makeshift tent using a canvas sheet draped over a rope stretched 6 feet from the fireplace, concentrating the heat into a smaller space where the children could stay marginally warm. Even so, they woke frequently, shivering, asking for more blankets that didn't exist. The cabin's interior temperature, measured by a mercury thermometer Creek kept on the mantel, read 42 degrees at 6 in the morning, despite the roaring fire. By 2 in the afternoon, when the fire was at its peak, the temperature struggled to reach 48 degrees. Creek had never seen conditions where he physically couldn't heat the cabin above 50 degrees, no matter how much wood he burned. The cold was winning through sheer massive force, overwhelming his heating capacity. 42 degrees sounds survivable, and it is, barely, when you're wrapped in wool and fur. But it's desperately uncomfortable. It saps your strength, and it means you're burning through your winter wood supply at 3 times the sustainable rate. Creek did the math in his head, counting the cords of split wood remaining in his shed, calculating consumption against days of winter left. If this cold snap lasted 10 days instead of 3, he'd run out of fuel with 2 months of winter remaining. That meant a choice between freezing to death or burning the cabin's own logs for fuel, destroying the shelter to stay alive inside it. On the 2nd day of the brutal cold, Margaret developed painful cracks in her hands from the constant cycle of wet and dry near the fire. Their son William complained of earaches, a sign that the sustained cold was affecting his respiratory system. Their daughter Sarah became listless and quiet, sleeping 18 hours a day, her body conserving energy in response to the cold stress. Martha and Henrik Jensen faced worse conditions. Their cabin, built with excellent Norwegian joinery and tight chinking, still dropped to 38 degrees inside during the coldest hours. Henrik developed a brutal cough on the 2nd day of the cold snap, the kind of deep rattling cough that signals the lungs are being damaged by sustained cold air exposure. Their daughter Anna, age 4, developed chilblains on her toes despite wearing 2 pairs of wool socks inside fur-lined boots. And Martha grew genuinely frightened that the child might lose digits to frostbite without ever going outside. They burned wood frantically, and Henrik made dangerous trips to their woodpile 6 times a day, returning each time with frost forming on his eyebrows and beard, his hands so cold he could barely grip the axe. Young Jacob Morrison nearly died on the third day. He'd run low on firewood, having underestimated his winter needs, and made the foolish decision to venture 300 yards to a stand of dead cottonwoods to cut fresh fuel. He'd worked methodically for 20 minutes, his axe ringing against frozen wood, his lungs burning with each breath of -46-degree air. He didn't notice the symptoms developing until it was too late. The extreme cold air was damaging his lungs with each breath, causing them to spasm and fill with fluid. The exertion of chopping accelerated his respiration, forcing more of that killing cold deep into his chest. By the time he'd felled 3 trees and limbed them into manageable logs, he was coughing uncontrollably, each cough producing a stabbing pain like knives in his chest. His lips had turned grey-blue, and he couldn't catch his breath. Morrison knew he was in trouble, serious trouble, but his cabin was 300 yards away, and he'd cut firewood that he desperately needed. He loaded 4 logs onto his shoulder, staggered 20 feet, and collapsed in a snowdrift. He got up, tried again, made it 40 feet this time, collapsed again. On his third attempt, he abandoned the logs and simply tried to reach the cabin door. He made it, barely, his vision tunneling to a narrow point of light, his chest making horrible rasping sounds. He fell through his cabin door and tried to restart the fire that had died to cold ash while he'd been outside. His hands wouldn't work right. He fumbled with kindling, dropped it, fumbled again. Finally got a small flame going, added larger sticks, collapsed beside it. The cabin temperature had dropped to 29 degrees, cold enough that frost formed on the inside walls. Morrison lay on the floor, unable to move, his breathing shallow and rapid, his body going into shock from cold exposure and lung damage. He would have died there, frozen on his own cabin floor 15 feet from a growing fire, if Samuel Creek hadn't noticed the absence of smoke from Morrison's chimney at noon. Creek, fighting his own exhaustion from 3 nights of interrupted sleep, forced himself to check on the younger man. He found Morrison semi-conscious, the cabin temperature still below freezing despite the small fire, and acted immediately. Creek built the fire up to a roar, sacrificing his own fuel to save Morrison's life. Then he wrapped the younger man in blankets, tried to get warm water into him, and realized Morrison needed more help than Creek alone could provide. He half-carried, half-dragged Morrison through the brutal cold to the Jensen cabin, where Margaret Creek and Martha Jensen were tending each other's children. The women took over Morrison's care, packing him in blankets, keeping warm compresses on his chest, forcing him to breathe steam from boiled water to ease his damaged lungs. He survived, but his breathing remained ragged for weeks afterward, and he never regained full lung capacity. The cold had permanently scarred his respiratory system. Before we continue with how Thomas Hartley's family fared in this same killing cold, hit that like button and comment below, telling me what's the coldest temperature you've ever experienced. I want to hear your survival stories. On the morning of December 26th, with the temperature still holding at -39, Samuel Creek made a decision. His wood supply was dropping at an alarming rate. His children were constantly cold, despite the fire, and he needed to know if there were better options. He wrapped himself in every layer he owned, covered his face with a wool scarf, and trudged the quarter-mile to Thomas Hartley's ugly stone cabin. What Creek saw when he arrived made him question his own sanity. Smoke rose lazily from Hartley's chimney, not the thick, urgent plume of a fire being fed frantically, but the gentle smoke of a fire burning low and easy. Creek knocked on the heavy timber door, and Thomas opened it wearing a simple wool shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows. The wave of warmth that rolled out nearly staggered Creek. "Samuel," Thomas said, his Lancashire accent soft, "come in from that cold. Lord, you look frozen." Creek stepped into the cabin and stopped dead. The interior was warm, genuinely warm, the kind of warmth you feel in a house in October, not during the worst cold snap in memory. His glasses fogged instantly. He stood there blinking, trying to process what his body was telling him. After 3 days of brutal, grinding cold, of forcing himself outside every 40 minutes to haul firewood, of watching his children shiver despite every effort he made, of calculating how many days until his fuel ran out, he'd stepped into a space that felt like a different world entirely. Thomas's wife, Elizabeth, sat at a table near a small window, sewing by daylight, her hands steady and relaxed. No gloves, no shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, just a simple day dress and an apron. Their 2 children, ages 7 and 5, played on the floor near the fireplace, building something from wooden blocks, their cheeks pink with health, their movements energetic. They were playing. Creek's children hadn't played in 3 days. They'd huddled under blankets, conserving energy, too cold to do anything but endure. The fireplace held a moderate fire, nothing extravagant, maybe 8 logs arranged in a loose pile that was burning down slowly. Creek's fireplace at that same moment held 12 logs stacked tight, burning fiercely, consuming fuel as fast as he could feed it. Creek pulled off his mittens and held his hands toward the fire, feeling warmth soak into his frozen fingers, and noticed the thermometer hanging on the wall. 68 degrees. He looked at it again, certain he'd misread. 68 degrees Fahrenheit, while it was minus 39 outside. A 107-degree temperature differential maintained, with what appeared to be a casual, almost lazy fire. In Creek's cabin, working desperately, burning wood at an unsustainable rate, he'd achieved a 61-degree differential, and his family was still suffering. "How?" Creek managed. His voice came out hoarse. "How in God's name?" Thomas gestured to the walls. "Thermal mass and dead air, Samuel. The stone outside holds heat from the sun during the day and from the building during the night. The gap between the walls stops cold from getting in and heat from getting out. The sod roof keeps warmth from rising away, and because the heat can't escape, we don't need to make much of it." Creek walked to the wall and pressed his palm against the inner logs, warm to the touch, almost hot. He looked at the fireplace. The fire was smaller than what he maintained in his own cabin, and the wood consumption looked to be a third of what he was burning. "I've been feeding my fire every 40 minutes, Creek said quietly. "Round the clock, my family's still cold. You're burning maybe a quarter of my wood and you're comfortable." Thomas nodded. "The numbers work out to about 58% less wood, for better results," he said. "I calculated it before I built. I knew it would work, but I understand why you all thought I was mad. It looks wrong from the outside." Creek stood there in the warm cabin, feeling the cold leach out of his bones, and did something that would have been unthinkable 3 days earlier. He admitted he'd been completely, fundamentally wrong. "I mocked you," he said. "Called this cabin ugly and wasteful, said you didn't know what you were doing. I was wrong, Thomas, dead wrong. This works. Lord above, this works better than anything I've ever seen." "Oh." Thomas poured Creek a cup of hot tea from a kettle on the stove, another luxury Creek's family couldn't afford with their wood situation. "I'm not angry, Samuel. You thought what seemed logical based on what you knew. But in Lancashire, we build with stone and thick walls, because wood's scarce and winters are wet and cold. I just adapted what I learned there to Wyoming conditions, used local materials, made it work here." The empirical data over the next week validated everything. Samuel Creek began keeping detailed records, comparing his cabin's performance to Hartley's. In minus 30 to minus 45-degree weather, Creek's cabin required 1 piece of firewood every 38 minutes to maintain an interior temperature of 41 to 46 degrees. Hartley's cabin required 1 piece of similar-sized firewood every 2 hours and 18 minutes to maintain 65 to 68 degrees interior. Creek's family burned through 1 cord of firewood in 3 days during the peak cold. Hartley's family burned 1 cord in 17 days. The fuel efficiency difference was 57%, almost exactly what Hartley had calculated before construction. But the real difference showed in livability. Creek's family survived barely, in constant discomfort and genuine danger. Hartley's family lived normally, warm and comfortable, able to work on indoor projects, able to sleep without piling on every textile they owned, able to eat hot meals without rationing fuel. Henrik Jensen visited on December 28th, still coughing from his cold-damaged lungs, and stood in Hartley's cabin with tears in his eyes. "I was wrong," he said simply, his Norwegian accent thick with emotion. "I said stone was cold, said your design was foolish. I'm a carpenter, supposed to know building, and I was wrong. I'm sorry, Thomas." Young Jacob Morrison, recovered enough to walk with help, came on December 30th. He'd nearly died from his own arrogance and inexperience, and seeing Hartley's warm, efficient cabin hammered home how close he'd come to freezing to death. "Mr. Hartley," he said, his voice still weak, "would you teach me how you did this? I need to rebuild before next winter, and I can't go through that again." Thomas didn't gloat, didn't remind them of their ridicule, didn't extract apologies or revel in vindication. He simply shared his knowledge. He took Samuel Creek through every detail of the construction, the 18-inch foundation trench, the vertical inner logs, the calculated 14-inch gap, the layered fill of straw and dry soil, the independent roof structure, the massive sod layer. He explained the physics in simple terms, showing how thermal mass and insulation worked together, how the design minimized convection and radiation losses, how the thick walls created thermal inertia that smoothed out temperature swings. He sketched diagrams on paper, provided measurements, suggested where to source materials. Creek took notes like a man studying scripture. By mid-January, when temperatures moderated to a more typical Wyoming winter range of 0 to 15 degrees, word had spread across the settlement and to neighboring homesteads. 17 families came to examine Hartley's cabin, to measure the walls, to ask questions, to understand. Thomas welcomed them all, repeated his explanations patiently, and encouraged them to adapt the design to their own needs and situations. The adoption happened rapidly. By spring of 1884, 43 families across northern Wyoming territory had either begun construction on Hartley-style cabins or had made detailed plans to do so. Some variations emerged. Families with more timber than stone reversed the materials, using double log walls with a packed earth fill. Others who lived near clay deposits built thick, adobe-style walls that incorporated similar thermal mass principles. A few ambitious builders created hybrid designs with stone outer walls and mortared fieldstone inner walls, eliminating wood entirely. Samuel Creek, with help from his 2 oldest sons and 3 neighbors, built a new cabin in the summer of 1884 that copied Hartley's design almost exactly. His measured fuel consumption for the winter of 1884-85 showed a 61% reduction compared to his old cabin, and his family lived in genuine comfort for the first time since moving to Wyoming. He calculated that the extra labor and materials paid for themselves in fuel savings in less than 3 years, and the improved quality of life was beyond price. Martha Jensen convinced her husband to build a smaller stone-walled structure they used as a combination root cellar and emergency warm room. During cold snaps, the entire family would sleep in this smaller space, which was easier to heat than their main cabin and provided backup shelter if their wood supply ran low. Hendrik's chronic cough disappeared after the winter of 1884-85, when he no longer had to breathe cold air for hours each day. Jacob Morrison's new cabin, built in summer 1884 with extensive help from Thomas Hartley, featured a modified design with slightly thinner walls but better insulation in the roof. Morrison's wood consumption dropped by 53%, and he survived the winter of 1884-85 with wood to spare and no health crises. The economic impact rippled through the community. Families who'd spent 40 to 50% of their summer and fall labor on wood cutting and hauling now spent 25 to 30%, freeing time and energy for other productive work. Crop cultivation improved because farmers could dedicate more hours to land clearing and planting. Women had more time for textile production because they weren't enduring months of cold-induced lethargy. Children's health improved markedly, with fewer respiratory illnesses and no more chilblains or mild frostbite cases. Dr. Raymond Foster, who served the settlement as physician, noted in his journal in March 1885 that winter illness rates had dropped by approximately 40% compared to previous years, which he attributed directly to improved cabin heating. Former critics became advocates and innovators. Samuel Creek designed a variation that included a small greenhouse attachment on the south wall, using the thermal mass principle to extend his growing season into November and restart it in March. Henrik Jensen developed improved techniques for shaping and fitting stones without mortar, sharing these methods with other builders. Even young Jacob Morrison contributed innovations, figuring out how to build the curved roof structure more efficiently using a simple jig he fabricated from scrap lumber. The knowledge spread beyond northern Wyoming. Travelers and new settlers carried descriptions east to Nebraska, west to Idaho Territory, south to Colorado. By 1887, variations of the Hartley cabin design appeared in settlement records across 5 territories and 3 states. Thomas Hartley died on March 14, 1891, at age 42, from injuries sustained when his horse spooked and threw him. He didn't live to see the full spread of his innovation, but his cabin stood as a monument to practical ingenuity. Elizabeth Hartley and the children remained in the cabin until 1903, when they moved to Denver. The structure was sold to a ranching family who used it continuously until 1947. In 1952, the Wyoming Historical Society documented the cabin's construction details and verified its origins. The building still stands today on private land near the town of Lovell, Wyoming, maintained by the descendants of the ranching family. Structural engineers who examined the cabin in 1979 confirmed that the thermal mass and insulation principles were sound and that the design would be effective in modern passive solar construction. A 1983 study by the University of Wyoming's Department of Atmospheric Science calculated that Hartley's design provided an effective R value of approximately R52, comparable to modern super-insulated buildings achieved entirely with 19th-century materials and hand labor. The National Park Service referenced Hartley's cabin in a 2004 report on frontier innovation and sustainable building practices. Modern builders have recreated the design principles in contemporary homes across Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas, often combining Hartley's thermal mass approach with modern insulation materials to create structures that require minimal heating even in extreme cold. The near loss of this knowledge is sobering. If Thomas Hartley had died in that 1883 cold snap instead of surviving to demonstrate his cabin's effectiveness, his innovation might have died with him, dismissed as the failed experiment of an eccentric British immigrant. If Samuel Creek had been too proud to admit error, if Henrik Jensen had clung to his Norwegian methods despite evidence, if the community had remained closed to foreign ideas, the knowledge might have stayed confined to one ugly cabin that worked. Traditional building wisdom, accumulated over centuries in different climates and cultures, contains solutions to problems we still face today. Energy-efficient housing, thermal comfort without massive fuel consumption, sustainable construction using local materials. These aren't new challenges. Hartley didn't invent thermal mass or dead air insulation. He simply recognized principles that English stonemasons had known for generations, adapted them to Wyoming's specific conditions, and proved through brutal empirical testing that they worked. The lesson extends beyond cabin construction. How often do we dismiss unfamiliar methods because they look wrong or contradict our experience? How much valuable knowledge do we lose because we're unwilling to test ideas that challenge conventional wisdom? Hartley's ugly cabin stands as a reminder that effectiveness matters more than appearance, that foreign ideas might solve local problems, and that admitting error and learning from others is a strength, not a weakness. Give this video a like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what other historical building techniques you want me to investigate. What frontier innovations have we forgotten? What traditional knowledge deserves revival? Let me know. Next time, we're diving into a Norwegian immigrant's food preservation system that used ice harvested in January to keep meat fresh until September without any refrigeration. A technique so effective that his neighbors thought he was using witchcraft until he showed them the simple physics behind it. You won't want to miss it.